explore that with you. This is written to the people of Israel that are standing with Moses at Mount Sinai, and it says to those who are not here as well. And we interpret that to mean the Jewish people throughout history that were not literally at Mount Sinai, but were genetically at Mount Sinai, because all Jews today are genetically connected to the Jews standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. You ever think about that? Check the DNA. And then many non-Jews have joined with the Jewish people over the years, what Paul calls grafted in Gentiles, as many of you are. So this message is really for all of us, those standing at Mount Sinai and those of us who are here now today. And we need to see this caution. He says there, let there be no root among you that produces such bitter poison. Moses goes on to explain that a person who presumes that the oath of blessing means that he can persist on going his own way will find God's judgment against him. You can't just go your own way and expect God to bless. No, the bottom line is trust God and follow the covenant, and then expect God's blessing. That seems sort of fair, doesn't it? Now we know about God's mercy. Thank God, God is merciful. And because of grace we are saved, right? But we're talking about blessings in the here and now, not salvation in the there and then. We have to get through today. I have no influence on what happens in the there and then, the world to come. That's God's problem. Neither do you. We do have influence over what happens in the world today. So why would Moses, in the midst of this speech, say that it's important that do not allow bitterness to grow up within the community? You know, a bitter root can ruin the taste of poison. Likewise, it can ruin the taste of a community. This is why it's to be dealt with rather than allowed. It's actually to be literally pulled out of the ground. What is a bitter root? Gall. Gall is a bitter root. Gall causes bitterness. It's part of our biology. But when gall spills over into your system, it ruins the taste of food. Gall has a purpose, but not if it spreads. You know, if you've ever been cut off when you're driving by some driver and you go, that galls me, right? You say, that galls me. Well, what you're saying is it's making me feel bitter. That's not a good way to be. God is saying that when the person who has bitterness in their heart is very bad for their health, their physical health, their emotional health, their spiritual health as well. They get sick. Bitterness causes illness. In the days of the New Testament, there was a man named Simon, Shimon. He was a sorcerer. The Bible calls him a sorcerer. That's sort of a magician. And Simon the sorcerer, this is in Acts 8, was very popular in his community of Samaria. He could do all kinds of magic tricks. But what he saw was Peter the apostle doing all kinds of even better magic tricks, like healing the sick and raising the dead. That was kind of a magic trick that he thought was really cool. So he got bitter because he didn't have that ability. In fact, these supernatural gifts were given to Peter for a reason. They were not given to Simon for a reason. And so Peter says to Simon, you are full of bitterness and captive to sin. They always go together. If you're bitter in your heart, it leads you to sin. That's why Moses cautioned the people to get idolatry and the accompanying root of bitterness out of the community. He connected idolatry with bitterness. A person who is bitter ends up becoming an idolater of some sort. When Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, in Romans 3 was explaining the fact that we're all sinful and that we all are in need of a Savior, he referred to Psalm 10, verse 7, and stated that the people's mouths were full of cursing and bitterness. He knew that bitterness was connected to cursing and sin. And bitter hearts lead always to rebellion against God and vice versa. Let me repeat that. A bitter heart always leads to rebellion against God. If you have a bitter heart, you can't help but sin. And once the person sins, we know there is some sort of a judgment. In Paul's letter to the believers in Ephesus, that we just heard this morning from Ephesians 4, where Paul is telling them how to live as believers in the light of God's love, in addition to reminding them to speak the truth to each other, and to not let the sun go down on their anger, and to stop stealing, and such like that. He said, get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, along with every other form of malice. The same advice was given to the Hebrew believers as recorded in the book of Messianic Jews, also known as Hebrews, where the writer to the Hebrews says, see to it that no one misses the grace of God and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. Hebrews 12, verse 15. Look at the connection. If a person harbors bitterness in their heart, they can miss the grace of God. Remember the question I said, so if you have bitterness towards somebody in your heart, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is it doesn't just hurt them. They may not even know you're bitter, that the people you're bitter toward. They may not have any idea, and they don't even care. It hurts us. It hurts us. So the writer to the Hebrews says, it causes us to miss the grace of God. James in the New Covenant, Yaakov writes, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. James describes envy as something that causes bitterness, which we have learned is defiling and causes us much trouble. So we see that many places in the Bible are clear as day that bitterness is bad news. Bitterness poisons individuals. It poisons relationships. It poisons congregations. It poisons communities. And yet sometimes we're so cavalier and careless about it that we don't even pay much attention to it. We just say, we're going to stay bitter. Are any of you bitter toward anybody? Anybody? Past, present, future? Do you harbor some bitterness, some anger that you've been keeping in your heart for a long time? It's defiling you and your body and the people that you come in contact with. Remember, beware of the bitter root. Rather than deal with the bitterness we find in our hearts, we sometimes harbor it. Sometimes we nurse it until we poison our own lives and the lives of our loved ones. We may be careful not to eat swine, treif. Maybe we're good at that. We may be careful not to work on Shabbat. We may tithe faithfully and clearly 10% of our earnings goes to the Lord. We might do all those wonderful things, but if we have hidden bitterness in our hearts, all the rest is for naught. The sin of bitterness allows a sword to fester, a spiritual sword to fester that never heals. Bitterness is like yeast. Yeast expands. If we harbor bitterness in our hearts, it expands to every aspect of our lives. It spreads. You know, in Africa, they found a poison called harari. And one of the ways the Africans do so well hunting, they put a little drop of harari on the end of their spear, or the arrows. And when they send them into an animal, the animal drops dead. It's poison, but it's so strong, it's immediately fatal. Bitterness can be like that. I had a family friend years ago. Actually, he was a friend of my mother's, a very messed up man. He was a committed atheist, a committed pagan, and he hated me. He used to call me on the phone, cursing me out. Just out of the blue, I get a phone call from this guy, my mother's friend, cursing me out. He even threatened my life one time. Seriously. I won't tell you his name. Of course, you won't know him. But this is on whatever this is called, this YouTube or Facebook. I told every family member of mine at the time that we're not going to allow him to do this and aggress us. So I told this man we would not take his phone calls anymore or even have anything to do with him because his bitterness was getting painful. So I told him we're not going to talk to him anymore. Of course, when I drew the line, it sort of put him in a tailspin because he wanted to have somebody to be bitter at because it couldn't be bitter at my mother because she was so nice to him. So he was bitter at my mother's son, me, and my children because he could get away with it until I finally drew the line and said, you can't do that anymore. So we separated ourselves from him totally, and he went into a tailspin and had a nervous breakdown, was hospitalized. A couple weeks after all that, I got a letter from him, a very repentant letter. He said, my problem with you, Rabbi, he liked to call me a rabbi, sarcastically. My problem with you, Rabbi, is I'm envious of your life. He said, you have a beautiful family, you have a congregation, and you have faith in God. And I'm envious. So that envy caused that bitter root to grow in him. It was a very sincere letter, I thought. So I wrote back and said, yes, I forgive you because I'm also a sinner. And I know that my sins have been forgiven in Messiah Yeshua. So even though I will not allow you to aggress my children anymore, I will forgive you of what you've done. I will not allow a root of bitterness to grow up inside me, because I knew that would affect me forever. So I had to forgive him, right? Have you forgiven people who have hurt you? Think about it. Have you? If you haven't, you've allowed that little bit of bitterness to find a root. Unfortunately, this man, this friend of my mother's, had built up such bitterness in his life that even after I forgave him, it wasn't enough for him. He committed suicide. His bitterness overwhelmed him. He could not forgive himself, even though God and I had forgiven him. He ended his life because he was eaten up by bitterness. Unchecked bitterness leads directly to death. Now let me give you a few things to think about. Because we have to figure out how to deal with bitterness. Maybe you can admit there's some bitterness in your heart towards somebody. And hopefully we can deal with it today. I'm going to give you some suggestions. By the way, if any of you have ever been gardeners, anybody ever had a little garden or a lawn? You know what? I hate weeds. Weeds are like devil. Weeds don't stop. You pluck them up and they come back. They grow faster than the flowers. they're not attractive. It's like, God, why'd you create weeds? I often ask that as I'm in my garden trying to pull up the weeds. But weeds are hard to get out of your garden and out of your lawn, but they have to be done. And the best way to do that is not with Roundup, it's with elbow grease. The best way to get rid of weeds is to pull them out of the ground from the root and not let them put seeds back in the lawn or back in the garden. Pull them out of the ground, rip them up, and put them in a bag and get them out of your house. Get them out of your yard. Because they sprout more weeds. I think it's a great lesson that God gave us in the natural world. If you really want to get your garden and your lawn looking good without the weeds, you got to yank them up. Yank them up, put them in a bag, and take them away and burn them up if possible. Otherwise, they'll come back, and next year they'll come back even stronger. That's the problem with bitterness. So the writer to the Hebrews said, "See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by that many will be defiled." If you have bitterness in your heart towards somebody, it causes trouble and leads to being defiled. So let's look at 4 ways to spot to see if you have a bitter root. Maybe some of you think you have no bitterness. That may be true. But I want to run by 4 ways to know if you have a bitter heart, and then I'll tell you what to do about it, okay? Number 1, ask yourself, are you replaying past videotapes in your mind? Are you replaying past tapes in your mind that happened to you with somebody, with a parent, a friend, an associate? If you keep replaying those tapes in your mind, guess what? You have a bitter root. Do you focus on what that person did to hurt your feelings all the time? Then you have a bitter root. Are you replaying the tapes? It's a sign of having a bitter root. Beware the bitter root. Secondly, is your mouth sort of out of control, meaning, like Romans 3:15 says, their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. There is a connection between what comes out of our mouth and the bitterness that's in our hearts. If you have bitterness in your heart, it's going to come out of your mouth. Are you sometimes critical, snappy at people, short-tempered, judgmental? You say things negative. It demonstrates a bitter root in your heart. Third, are you physically sick in any way? Dr. Carson Roche did a study of bitterness for 15 years. Here's what he said. When harbored for a long time, bitterness may forecast patterns of biological dysregulation, a physiological impairment that can affect metabolism, immune response, or organ function, and physical disease. Scientists have concluded that bitterness, if left unchecked, interferes with the body's hormonal and immune system. Bitter people tend to have higher blood pressure and heart rate and are much more likely to die of heart disease and other illness. Beware the bitter root. It shortens your life. And then take a look at your family. Take a look at the people that you're close to, your clan. Is there bitterness there as well? We read in Deuteronomy 29, verse 18, well, we didn't get to there, but it says, beware lest there be among you a man or a woman or a clan or a tribe whose heart is turning away from God, from the Lord our God, to go and serve the gods of those nations, idolatry. Beware lest there be among you a root bearing poisonous, bitter fruit. You see, idolatry and bitterness are connected over and over again in the Bible. And the fourth way to tell if you have bitterness is look at the people around you. Are you influencing them to be bitter? Are you causing other people to pick up the same bitterness that you might have towards somebody? Are you speaking words in your mouth that develop bitterness in the hearts of other people? If so, it's an indication that you have a bitter root. So what do we do about this? I want to give you a few things to think about, and then we're going to close. Remember, our goal here is to find ways to rid ourselves of any bitter root in our heart. Now, you may not feel bitterness towards anybody right now. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're a very forgiving person and have no bitterness at all in your heart. I doubt it, but maybe so. Maybe you're sort of like a saint and you don't have any bitterness in your heart. But I've never met a living saint. Maybe you are. Great. But in case you ever get some bitterness in your heart, here's what you can do about it. There's three reasons, three things you can do. First, I want you to think about this. We're not coming into a new country now, are we? We're not moving into the land of Israel, but we're moving into a new year. Tomorrow night is Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of a new year. So let's do this. While we're ready to move into a new year, not a new land, let's make some commitment to get bitterness out of our hearts in the coming year. And we're going to use the next 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, called the Yomim Noarim, the days of awe, the time that we are specifically challenged to go and make amends with anybody that we have harmed during the year, or perhaps have insulted or hurt us. Let's use the 10 days of awe to get rid of bitterness. Listen, it's serious. If you have bitterness in your heart towards somebody, deal with it during these 10 days coming up. It does no good to maintain a bitter root. Secondly, this is tough. This is tough. Start praying for that person. Oh, yeah. The person that you feel bitter toward or feels bitter toward you, pray for that person. Whoa! No, they don't deserve my prayers. No, they don't. They deserve your curses. But if those people are bitter and they're causing bitterness to you, they're going to have enough trouble in their lives. You need to pray for them. Messiah said, pray for our enemies. Pray for those who even despitefully use or abuse you. Oh, God, what a concept. And third, pray with me now that we can start yanking up that bitter root that lays inside of our hearts. We have to do it. It's only us that can do it with God's help. So here's the prayer I'm going to leave you with, and I want you to pray with me. I want you to pray with me. I'm going to lead the prayer, and I want you to pray with me. Maybe you don't feel bitter toward anybody today, but maybe it'll be next week, or maybe next year, or maybe a couple years from now, or maybe when you get a little older and you are yourself more crotchety. Because when you're crotchety, you're bitter toward anybody. So pray with me now, will you? Out loud. Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I confess I have or might have a root of bitterness in my heart. Toward and quietly fill in the blanks. You don't have to say out loud the person, but towards somebody. I know that you teach us in so many ways that bitterness is like poison and ruins relationships and joy. And today, I am deciding I will kill that bitterness toward fill in the blanks without saying out loud. I will not harbor hatred in my heart toward that person anymore. That person's root of bitterness doesn't have to affect my root of bitterness. Let's say that out loud. That person's root of bitterness doesn't have to affect my root of bitterness. Now let me just conclude by saying, we know that bitter feelings will bounce back from time to time, and therefore we have to remember that it's not a one-shot deal. Salvation is a one-shot deal. If you believe in Yeshua, if you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Period. End of story. But we live in a world that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And bitterness is horrible to have. So let us beware the bitterness that comes into our hearts when we're hurt, when we're angry, when we're disappointed. Beware the bitterness. Please stand for a layman.